Yeah, you can go to the front door. That's right, right? You ready? Live? Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm really excited about this discussion today. My name is Jen Murtazashvili. I am the director of the Center for Governance and Markets that's co-sponsoring this event alongside Pitt Cyber. So my center is the Center for Governance and Markets. I think I said that. So really excited to have everyone here with us today to talk about the ethics and regulation of generative AI. And we like this term generative AI because it's broader and has us thinking about the kinds of things that many of us are really concerned, excited, or worried about. And that is the phenomenon that we've seen as ChatGPT. And we've seen that this has been rolled out almost in every sector since it launched in November. And there's a lot of hype about it, but there's a lot of real world implications that we haven't studied. So in this discussion today, we're going to talk about potential for regulation of generative AI, how it transforms teaching and learning. And there's no better group to do this with than the experts we have amassed with us today. So let me introduce them in the order of their appearance next to me. First, we have Annette Vee, who is the Associate Professor of English and Director of the Composition Program here at the University of Pittsburgh. She teaches a lot of courses on writing and digital composition. She's also the Director of a Composition Program. So these issues about generative AI really hit close to home in the pedagogical space. We have David Hickton, who is the founding director of the University of Pittsburgh Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security. He has appointments in the School of Law, the School of Computing and Information, as well as here in the Graduate School of Public and National Affairs. Very long and esteemed history as a public servant. Most recently served as staff director and senior counsel to the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis. Can't believe that's still a hard word to say. And prior to coming to Pitt, he served as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania. And very important role, and in your role did a lot of work on cyber issues and really brought those to the forefront of public policy here in the United States. And then we have Ravit Dotan, who is a doctoral scholar here at the Center for Governance and Markets, and she is launching the Collaborative AI Responsibility Lab, which she'll be leading. And her research focuses on how to help companies, investors, and public administrators engage with AI and data more responsibly. So just a delight to have all of you here. I want to begin this discussion talking about the potential benefits that all of you see from ChatGPT, from generative AI in your respective fields. We're going to talk a lot about risks. And I just want to start off on a positive note. If you can think about how this contributes to your field in a positive way. Annette, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of positives. So one of the more exciting ideas that I've seen floated around and I think has been tested out in some ways is in terms of communication for people of different kinds of communicative needs or literacy levels. And so one of the things you can do with large language models is to shift the kind of vocabulary register and reading level of a piece of writing. And so say you have in a medical context, you have a medical report, a doctor may need certain kinds of things from that report. They know a whole bunch of vocabulary that would enable them to enact something in that report. A nurse may need to have, different information from a patient's medical record. And so they would need to then, understand issues of care. But then if you have, say, parents of a child who's a patient, and they may not have, the full medical jargon and vocabulary to understand what's going on, but it's really important that they do understand what's going on. And so you can take, say, data or medical report and translate it into something that's more readable because, getting hard news, say, for medical information is very difficult to do in person. sometimes parents take a while to process it or patients take a while to process it. And having something actually written down can be really useful for people who, especially if English is not their first language, and they may want to revisit the report or things like that. So that's one application that I think is really beneficial. And then I would say too, the creative possibilities are really great. So for like creative writing, there's a lot of my colleagues and those of us who write for a living, I think are trying to experiment with these tools in order to kind of get ideas to generate different directions that we might not have already thought of. I've done that already with Midjourney, which is a generative AI for image creation, trying to illustrate an article that I'm thinking about, and it gives me new ideas about things. So those are a couple ideas. I think in terms of teaching too, that creative aspect is really important for thinking for students in the composition program. We're very interested in how writing is happening in the world and how to prepare students for that kind of writing, and when they go out into the world, like how are they going to be able to write in the world, and in creative and professional contexts. And so
I want us definitely to talk about the teaching aspect.
Yeah.
It's a big, and that's something I want to come back to later.
Yeah, so I think that those things apply in those ways too.
Okay,
so thank you.
David.
I think the benefits to this technology are as much as we can imagine. And for example, there's a lot of writing online that catalogs how this will help us as customers in service industries, as banking customers, or to be able to get concierge services when you're traveling or when you're doing care from your doctor, as mentioned. But I think in Pitt Cyber, when we talk about benefits, one of the things that we are always focused on is digital equity, and the question of how the internet can be leveraged to reduce the opportunity gap in our country, to reduce economic inequality. And you can just imagine the applications for someone who has less resources or poor or immigrant new to our country, and being able to take advantage of this technology to put themselves in a better position to compete. So that's what I think is the most exciting frontier.
Yeah, and a lot of our global partners that we work with at CGM are implementing it very effectively and efficiently in their own workflows. It's quite amazing to see how quickly people use it as a tool. Yeah, Ravit.
Thanks. I also want to address the topic of equality and opportunities around that. I mean, of course, the benefits, the list is so long of potential benefits. I'm just choosing one as an example. And yeah, so I'm a person whose first language is not English. Also, I'm stuck with this accent. That makes people sometimes treat me as stupid. It is just a fact. I'm one of many. Also, sometimes my English is not idiomatic or even grammatically correct. Also an issue in emails. So with generative AI, of course, you could create text, also audio, and there's an opportunity here for people who don't have this language as their first language. They face those kind of barriers, right? It could take it away. It could make it less so. And I'm also saying it as someone my background is in philosophy. I've taught many students. I see the kind of gap that you get, between different competency levels. It could be because of nationality. It could be because of many other factors. It is a tool that could help in equalizing ways of communication and helping more kinds of people sound authoritative. That comes with the other side of the coin, which I also really like. What ChatGPT is really good at is sounding authoritative. I think that's something that OpenAI has really mastered. Sounding authoritative, no matter what you want to talk to a 5-year-old, can sound authoritative. You want to talk to a professional, can sound authoritative. So it really gives this opportunity for people to sound authoritative. On the other hand, when ChatGPT says nonsense, it sounds just as authoritative, and it says nonsense a lot. And so I'm hoping that with time, I hope the hype will go down a little bit and people will start being more critical and notice all of the nonsense that this machine is speaking out. And I hope it could decrease that bias to that authoritative sound, so that more kinds of people would, this way of speaking will just not be automatically perceived as this authoritative thing. So hopefully that's another way that this technology can increase this, I don't know how to call it, authoritativeness bias. Not a good thing, but.
So along those lines, it's, lots of benefits, obviously, but your description of benefits also highlights risks, right? That the technology can pose. It can create a more level playing field, especially for non-native English speakers. But I think one of the bigger issues that we're seeing pop up recently deal with security issues and cybercrime. And David, you had a piece recently in The Hill where you highlighted how hackers are using this technology. So I've used it for coding. It's amazing. Like, it's produced little codes that I've used in different applications. It's amazing how much code it knows. This issue of regulation, we know that regulations are imperfect, especially regulations of technology. The technology moves much faster than our ability to understand it and regulate it. Given the threats, to regulate a technology that's relatively new, and given often the information mismatch between government officials and the private firms that are producing this technology, where do you think regulation should sit right now? What kinds of regulation is needed, if any, and then how should we go about producing this regulation, given the complexity of the technology?
Good question. To amplify the preamble, I don't think we doubt that in the short term, as a result of this new technology, we're going to have more crime. We're going to have more sophisticated crime, and it's going to be harder to identify the perpetrators, because all cybercrime is about attribution, and it'll be easier without identity tools for cyber criminals to hide with a ChatGPT. It'll be easier for a less sophisticated criminal to become more sophisticated. So those are the threats in the short term in the cybercrime area. Now, when we talk about how we regulate anything in the technology field, whenever a new frontier is crossed, anyone who suggests regulation, particularly in this country where we are constantly in an anti-regulatory fever, faces the risk of being accused of trying to slow the advent of technology. And people will make arguments that this is really no different than we went from math tables to calculators, when we went from slide rules to calculators, when we went from linear research to Google search. This is just an enhanced version of Google search. And those are very good arguments. But we don't have to slow technology if we can recognize the distinction between hard regulation and soft laws and voluntary compliance guidelines. So already the creator of ChatGPT has talked about an identity tool, which is great. Today's news is that there is a collaborative effort on behalf of 10 developers of generative AI to develop a set of guidelines. And ultimately, we may end up with a regulatory scheme which is sort of hard law, but we can work towards voluntary compliance and tools in the short term, which can sort of ease the entry of this new technology. At the end of the day, what we're really looking for is to establish several things. We need awareness, we need transparency, then we need accountability, and then we have to develop standards. That's what and when we did the work at Pitt Cyber previously, looking at the use of decision-making algorithms by government components, that's what we were in pursuit of there. And generally, when there's a new technology which arrives on the scene, there are no standards. And so we're left with either the metaphor of the Wild West, which is frequently used, or the one I like to say, we're building the plane as we fly it.
Compared to other sectors, you've worked across so many different sectors in the cyber sphere. How does this generative AI domain differ from others in terms of the willingness to self-regulate? You can compare.
I've been heartened by how fast people have been willing to talk about regulation. And that may be a function of some of our prior experience. Many who are watching or here in the room may be too young to remember. I was teaching law school at a time that Napster and file sharing devices came on the scene. And at that time, we placed a premium on original invention and original thought, and copyright laws protected prior art. And so musicians were not able to take pieces of prior music and mix them and turn them into their own art and sell them. And if you wanted to listen to music, you had to purchase that music. And all those walls fell down. And now we're 25 years later. And the question rhetorically I would ask is, do we have better music, or does all the music sound the same? Do we have more original invention, original thought, more creative artistry, or do we have less? And I think people can answer those questions any way they want. I have my own point of view, but the rule of law was eroded by technology in that instance. And so people have watched this happen repeatedly with new technology. Self-driving cars, there's a whole host of issues there, which is another version of AI. And we say, well, a self-driving car just had an accident. How many accidents do human beings have every year? So the debate can be framed on either side of the issue. But I think as we've had more and more technology, particularly in the AI area, people are now willing more quickly to look at what does this mean. I think the one final thing I want to say, and I think this is operated here with ChatGPT and generative AI generally, is we now have a greater willingness to talk about who needs to be at the table. Technology people need to be at the table, law people and law and policy people need to be at the table, but the new seat at the table is for sort of the broader humanities, human factors, how people operate. That's a very important constituency that is now at the table. And I'm optimistic that we're going to work on this together.
And speaking of different perspectives that are here at the table, and these humanistic perspectives, Ravit, as a philosopher, you bring a very unique set of lenses to this question. And I know that you've been working very closely with industry on these issues. And I wonder if your perspective on sort of the self-regulatory capacity really resonates with what David just said, that you're seeing a lot of willingness of companies to take on regulation themselves. What does it look like from what you've seen within industry?
Okay, yes, I will answer that question. I do want to add some things to the previous answer. Okay, so I want to say about regulation that in the last few days, people have attempted something with generative AI. So in the US, as was mentioned, there is this reluctance towards regulation more than other countries, say European countries. But some of the laws that already exist already may or may not apply to ChatGPT already and other generative AI. For example, can ChatGPT commit a hate speech? Is it like legally possible? Or is it more like search engines where they just like show you things that other people have done? So search engines have legal protections. Should they or should they not be extended to generative AI is a question that is currently being debated. So I want to say that when it comes to regulation, even in countries that are resistant, still there are the current laws that could be extended to the new technologies. So I just want to put it also on the table as an option. I also want to say about regulation that I'm seeing also this willingness on the side of the industry for regulation to exist. For example, the founder of OpenAI recently stated that she would like there, to be regulations about generative AI. And I'm seeing those statements from other people as well. But I want to point out that we need to be cautious when we hear those statements, because they can be a way to avoid responsibility. Because the reality is that the companies that create those technologies, the people who use these technologies also have responsibility on themselves. And so there's something really easy in saying, yes, Senate, do something about it. I shall wait. And so I want to say that it is important to talk about regulation, and we should definitely do that. But when doing that, I think at the same time, it is important to remember that whether there is or isn't regulation, it doesn't take the responsibility from us, the creators and the users of the technology. Which moves me to the question I was actually asked, what is happening in industry? And principles were mentioned. This is something that is very prevalent in the space that is called AI ethics. We're seeing, because not generative AI, all AI technologies have caught us unprepared, as new technologies do. And so what we've been seeing is guidelines, lists of principles. In fact, this is good. Just today, we had a new guideline for synthetic media, another like generative AI. It's coming from one of the biggest nonprofits, partnership on AI. So just today, a few hours ago, came out a list of guidelines that they have for synthetic media. This is good. However, while we're seeing there's really an explosion of those principles. I mean, I guess we're beyond the point of explosion. Now it's already saturated. We're seeing a lot of the principles, mission statements coming from companies, governmental organizations, UNESCO, OECD, countries like the US has one. Everyone has like principles. But the problem is those principles, often there's a gap between them and action. And we're seeing through surveys that are showing what companies are actually doing, that there isn't really implementation of those principles. So it's staying at the level of a wish list of how we would like our AI to be, but we're not really seeing enough action being taken to have that AI be that way. So to me, that is one of the major concerns. There's a lot of like wishful talking, let's call them. So yeah, I'm really interested in how do we shift the system to move in a different way. And I think it happens. I think something we really need is shift in the way that we're thinking about this, how this technology is developed. Sometimes I think that people imagine this engineer, coding in some back room, and it's almost as if, people are pointing at that person saying, you do better, implement this tool, just like do it and it will solve the problem. That is a misconception of how this whole system works, because the reality is this engineer is a part of a company that has priorities. The engineer is limited in doing things if the company is not providing resources and incentives. So really a unit to think about is the company itself, but the company itself is also not alone. So it's also as if like we're pointing to tech companies, OpenAI, do better. But I think this is an incomplete way to understand the situation, because those tech companies that develop those tools are really a part of ecosystems, right? A part of bigger systems of incentives. There are investors, there are insurance companies, there are buyers to these AI. These all provide incentives for companies to do things in certain ways, regardless of regulation. So when I'm thinking about how we can push this industry to do things differently, regulation, yes, should be there. I'm not definitely, but also we should think of how those technologies and the companies that develop them are situated in a larger ecosystem and things we can do to make this ecosystem move differently. And I think there are things that we can definitely do. And I also think that there's a lot of things that we can do as academics to shift things in this ecosystem. And one last point to finish. When I think about the responsibility of the users of the technology, I think of universities having that responsibility big time when it comes to things like ChatGPT, because we create text. in different ways. And there are a lot of conversations about how to use generative AI in teaching, like what kind of assignments should I give? How do I make sure that my students don't cheat? Good conversations, definitely we should keep having them, but I'm not hearing enough conversations about what we do, how we self-regulate in our research. So recently Nature came out with just 2 rules for ChatGPT, just 2. I think it's a good start. It's definitely not enough, but I think we should have more conversations about what we produce. How do we use these technologies and come up with guidelines for ourselves and also ways to implement them so we don't end up with this wish list situation.
Great. We have a question from the audience, and I'd just like you to, you could speak up and first introduce yourself and then your question.
My name is Benham. I'm a PhD student in marketing. For the last 2-3 years, I've been working with generative AI models, published a paper in ethics and transparency of these models. I don't want to get into that because like there was some scenarios where like regulations actually backfire in certain scenarios that we show in our research. But generally speaking, they're better for the society to increase the welfare. But what I had the question in mind is that I'm sure like you know about how these models kind of work. Like they've seen text on the internet. That's why they're able to generate the text. But a concern that is really serious these days is that because these models are like because of the technological limitations of these models, it's so easy for users to bypass the limitations, even if there are regulations. Just a while ago, there was this thing called DAN, D-A-N. So it's like you tell ChatGPT do anything now and pretend that you're going to be an AI that's not limited by OpenAI. And so whatever I ask you, do not be confined by your limitations, answer me. And it works. Like, and then like OpenAI patches that, and some people try to do something else. Now they call it something else, and the AI has to follow the instructions. So it's like some sort of a battle that cannot be won without the users actually being more responsible. So that's the one question is like, how effective do you think the regulations can be when these exploits do exist in the way these models are made? And then basically, like Dan was just one example, but like we've seen that even with so much regulation, like Microsoft Bing generates some like results right now. It says like, I will not harm you unless you harm me first. So it's like, it's really serious concern. If you put it in a robot, it might kill you. So how do you think we should approach this problem where it seems the AI will always set itself free and escape from the limitations?
To me, the answer to that question comes in appreciating that the early promise for regulation is coming from Europe, just as was so with privacy with GDPR. The drafted proposal for an AI Act in Europe classifies risks in 3 categories: unacceptable, high-risk category, and other. And this has not been fully adopted yet, but it has received more positive support in Brazil. So it's a growing standard that could become law. I think that if you insist on transparency, and you bring a spotlight to every application in use, and you were to quickly classify them, we could spend time on what is unacceptable and what is high risk, and that may be sufficient for now. It's not going to be the long-term solution, but for now, it would be good.
Well, I just like that particular regulation, I think is interesting because it's assuming in many ways a kind of a static application of that. And you think about, and this is where I really appreciated, David, that you mentioned that humanists should be at the table because I'm at the table and I'm a humanist and thinking about the ways that people actually use the technologies and how they might, I mean, of course, people are going to try to trick the technology. I mean, this is my primary fun thing that I do with ChatGPT is try to make it say things that are like things it's not supposed to say because it's interesting to do. And so, I mean, I do other things too, but certainly, lots of people do that, right? That there's a kind of like prodding the model, right? And that's a very human impulse to prod the model and try to get it to do things, even if, you know, you're not looking for it to produce hate speech or whatever, but you're looking to prod the model. And so, and that, like, if there's a high risk situation, like you have it produce text, of course, but then you can scale that in different ways, and it can get disseminated in multiple different ways. And that, like, once the person has that, you know, how it leaves from there is a whole different
Right.
ball game. And then, you know, you get models like Stable Diffusion, you know, where you can just download it and then run it on your own computer and then disseminate it, you know. So I think those contexts just seem very difficult for me to like even understand how there would be, and this is why I'm genuinely interested in how you would actually regulate those contexts.
Well, I mean, your point is taken, but what is also dynamic is the relationship between what we're talking about and privacy. Well, you know, we are struggling with what are we going to require big tech to disclose about the sale of our private information and our viewing techniques, and artificial intelligence is now on steroids when you watch Netflix, for example. And you do not know that as a consumer. Many people in this country are very concerned about what the government is doing, but there's now an increasing appreciation for what big tech is doing. And I've been a voice for, let's have a responsible, not a combative conversation about that. Just this week in the Supreme Court, the Gonzalez Google case was argued, where the Section 230 immunity for big tech was debated in the context of the family of a woman who was killed in a terror attack in France, who's arguing that AI has transformed big tech from a publisher, which gets immunity, to from a reporter to a publisher. And so the intersection of what we're talking about were these other unsettled areas of the law is important to recognize.
You know, there's a joke in like some tech companies. They say like the product managers or project managers don't know what the engineers are doing. So they think if the joke is that if they think if a woman can give birth in 9 months, then non-women can give birth in like to 9 children in like 1 month. It's just like a joke that shows that like oftentimes people who are in charge of these decisions don't really know how this thing actually works. So they might put limitations on the like technical aspects of things, whereas the solution might be elsewhere. So that's like when the talks about humans in the loop are brought up, I think that's really important. Like also ask like more tech savvy people who are in these companies to present their ideas, because if the representatives of, for example, Google or OpenAI are product managers, they might think that something is possible, whereas it is not actually technically possible.
Well, and you know, if we had my banking friends in the room, they would take the opportunity at the first instance to complain about Dodd-Frank. But when I've had conversations with them, I said, regulations like that don't arise organically out of the ground. They arise because of abuse. They arise because we played a casino with our banking system. They arise because we had vice presidents at certain banks selling credit cards to people who didn't exist because they were given a bogey to sell 10 credit cards a day. And so I've defended regulatory abuse in debates like that. But a better way to look at regulation, and I think this is a unique opportunity when you talk about generative AI, is to do it proactively as opposed to reactively. We now know, with people like those assembled in this room and online, what some of the issues are right now before people are harmed. And we could do something right now. That's why I am so encouraged by the voluntary collaboration of the 10 who've come forward with voluntary guidelines. I'm so encouraged. Is it Mia Murata, who basically the creator of OpenAI, who said we need regulation? I told people it was because she read my article on the Hill. I'm not sure that's true.
Say something.
Yeah, I want to add a layer to your question. I just want to say that I think this question is really important with any technology. It reminds me of this game between those who write encryption and those who break encryption. It's an endless game of cat and mouse. It will never end. And I think there's no reason to think that anything different will happen with people who write AI and people who try to abuse it. And adding a layer to that, there are also new ways to commit fraud in reality. Now in the age of AI, for example, here's something I saw a few days ago. So you may know that some of the generative AI that create images, sometimes when they create like hand, the hand will have 6 fingers. Yeah, so here's another way to commit fraud or like to steal something. Have select a ring to add on a finger. So it will look like that the image was generated by AI. Like I didn't do it, someone generated my image. Really creative, I was so impressed. But I'm thinking I think we need to embrace the fact that it is gonna be this endless game of cat and mouse, as with other types of fraud. And I think the way to address it is to think application by application, because in every case, it's just gonna be something different. So I'll just give an example. One of the challenges with generative AI is misinformation, right? Like, how do you know that this image of 6 fingers is someone who actually stole this politician? Did they put like this finger on, or like, did they really steal something? How do you know? We've shifted to an era where we see an image, and I think we should immediately be suspicious. Is this true or not? It's the opposite of the whole, where like an image was like incriminating evidence, an image of you doing it. We're not there anymore. So what do? Like we could, like one way to go would be to build like various protection measures for, like generating the images, but I think that would be really difficult. So instead, embrace where we are. And now I think the onus of proof is on the person who's presenting the text or the image or the video. Show me that this is real. And there are industry-wide efforts already to create not just standards, but actual like code that you can implement into your system. I mean, when you produce generative AI, because I also work with companies that make generative AI. And so when the generative AI like produces an image or a video, it's stamped with, oh, and this is where it came from. And so how do I trust an image? Because if the New York Times shows it, maybe I trust the New York Times, or it has like the New York Times stamp on it. I know that I can trust that image. And the reason I'm going this far with this analogy is that I think consumer awareness is really, really important for these kind of things to succeed. So if we as consumers know which questions to ask and which products to choose, I do think, each and every one of us is just one person, but it is meaningful. So I, for example, am looking to buy like a security system for my house. I have a lot of questions that I'm going to ask about what they're going to do with their data. And so I think this is all to say that maybe to like repeat my point from before, regulation, super important, needed. However, it's never going to be sufficient, especially given this game of cat and mouse. And so I'm adding this layer of consumer awareness, proactivity in choosing products. This is another way to push those who create those technologies to implement security measures in them.
So, along these lines, we have a question from the audience, and I think it'll be our last big question on regulation before we get to the teaching and the educational component. I know there's a lot of people who are interested in that, and I promised Brian that I would speak up so people could hear the microphone. So question, and I think this is for you, David, but if anybody wants to chime in, do you see the interest in issues with GAI like ChatGPT is bringing major Western democratic players, particularly the US, EU, and UK, closer together on regulatory issues such as IP regulation or cybersecurity regulation?
Yes, no question. And I think that if we have to parse that, I think the United States is further along than Europe in cyber law enforcement, but Europe is actually further along than the United States in law and policy. We can learn from Europe.
Oh, can I disagree? I think that AI ethics brings another dimension of geopolitics dynamic. I mean, not that anything you said is false. But I'm seeing it's an interesting dynamic because US, UK, and the EU, they all have different perspectives on regulation. And the role of regulation, the role of the state, different opinions about that. And these are coming to the floor when it comes to AI, right? So Europe has this intention to pass a law specifically for AI, the EU AI Act. This is supposed to be a law about like any AI, as they've said, putting it into risk categories. UK has come out saying pretty strongly, we disagree with this entire approach. We shouldn't have a law for like AI as a blank thing. We should have a sector by sector regulation. US, I think, is also more into, well, US is different because of all the states. But it seems that, and then there's like, I think like power dynamic here going on because countries want to be the country that will set the tone for AI. And so there's competition that brings out some of the disagreements, like deep ideological disagreements. And so in a way, I think it must bring, the big forces together because you can't really confine AI in countries. It doesn't work like that. But on the other hand, what I'm seeing now is butting heads a little bit, not to mention China, right? So it's an interesting dynamic, I think.
Let me respond. That's a good point, but I think that the one thing that I've come to appreciate, particularly in my outreach, when we talk about the application of law to cyber and digital space, which really was my mission when I was U.S. attorney and my mission today, is when I've gone to places, particularly overseas, people have pointed out to me that my American Western, my American Europe point of view is biased that law always operates to protect us. And in many places, law operates to authorize totalitarianism. And increasingly, that's a problem across the globe. So while there may be difference between us and some of our European partners in the short term, we are united in the application of law generally for the common good. Now, that is not so in Turkey, that is not so in Russia, that may not be so in the Philippines, it's probably not so in China and other countries I could name. And I think that where the law is leveraged along Western values, we can tolerate and actually encourage and benefit from fruitful debate about what the elements of AI regulation should be. But we are going to always have a problem when we're debating law with those who would use law to entrench the powerful to oppress.
I would just say I agree 100% with that because as someone who works on countries with very weak rule of law, oftentimes Western, American, European solutions actually exacerbate predation and corruption by creating a rule of law framework that actually empowers predatory states to really harm people. So I think that nuance is very important as we're discussing this. I'm going to switch now to teaching. And well, before we get to teaching, communication, because there are several questions that have come in from the audience that echo some of the concerns I know that you, Annette, have had, that you have raised previously about the implications of ChatGPTs and other LLMs for global communication and English dominance, particularly in translation and smoothing out writing into idiomatic English. You mentioned how this might impact those with low literacy skills. We have a question from the audience on this actually specifically about how text in English is biased towards the US and UK compared to South Asia, South Africa. That bias may be a concern in ChatGPT's answers. Wanted to know what your thoughts were about this and how to handle this. Yeah.
So those are really good questions. And I think, Ravit, you brought that up about speaking from your own perspective too, about, translation or smoothing out accents or whatever, and thinking about, there's a couple different ways to think about how we kind of understand a wide variety of global Englishes, right? So like differences in dialects and speech patterns and, across English as a global language, right? And so if we are accepting of a wide variety of Englishes, like that's maybe an ideal. The other alternative may be to have everybody narrow their English into some sort of, idiomatic standardized English, right? Which like has a whole lot of problems involved in it, and like who is the standard and how is that established and what does that look like, and all these kinds of things. Like this is a really central question in how we teach writing, especially say in composition classes, and how should you, given the fact that say you experience bias when you move around in the world and you're not speaking always perfectly idiomatic English, and that is obviously a phenomenon that many people experience. How do we train everybody to be like, hey, get over it? Versus should we be training students to like speak in these kinds of ways, right? Like this is a central question. And will this technology then push us? And this is what I'm afraid of, is that it will push us more towards that kind of standardized English. And I want to put that very deliberately in quotes, because standardized English is, of course, an idiomatic, usually American English. It's usually Eurocentric, like white centric. It's middle class. It's so it's and so I think there's real dangers in having us look at like LLMs and like big language models and having them reproduce the kinds of biases that we already have in language, and encouraging people to kind of flatten out some of those accented Englishes. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that or
No, I think, yeah, it's one of my worries too. I mean, starting with tools like Grammarly, which I love and I need.
I think all of us do.
Yes. I also love the reports when it's, applauding me for knowing words. It's like, yes, thank you. I do have a yeah, I absolutely share the concern. I don't really have anything to add, because I think you put it so nicely, except for just like mentioning what I said at the beginning, where I'm hoping that the bias towards when someone speaks in a certain way, it just gives you kind of confidence because you're biases. I hope that this can weaken by seeing, when you see ChatGPT says things, top level of confidence, and it's total nonsense. I do hope that those kind of things will decrease the initial bias. So that is something I hope.
That's one of the, it's a difficult thing though, because I think you have to have the knowledge to evaluate whether it's right or not in order to understand that it's,
yeah, that's true,
that it's speaking inaccurately. And so from an educational perspective, I think this is one of the big open questions, is if a language model produces, confidently certain things, and it's may or may not be right, that how do we, or grammatically, if we're thinking about, idiomatic English or whatever, that how does somebody who doesn't have the kind of pre-existing knowledge about what it might be producing, how do they evaluate it?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's such a core part of the challenge. Sometimes the mistakes that it makes are obvious. Like maybe you saw this too, that it gave an evaluation, like a wireless something. And then one of the critiques was that the cord was too short. Like, yes.
I asked it to write a bio for me. Someone had someone asked for a bio. So I haven't rewritten my bio in so long. I asked ChatGPT. It gave me 3 books I had never written. I was very proud of it.
Yeah, totally. So just to complete the thought, having said that, still people have this confidence. I think it's part of the hype and excitement, like, you can give me stuff. I think that's another place where we as educators have a responsibility in educating our students on how to use those tools. And I think it's a part of, policies we can have when we assign papers. If you're gonna use LLMs, which is fine, there are standards about, for example, fact checking, right? And so if they learn that you can use this tool, like great, but don't forget to fact check and show them how. I think that perhaps put them automatically in a more, let's call it inquisitive or critical frame of thought. So definitely, I don't think it's going to happen on its own. But I think we as educators can help nudge things in a better direction.
We're trending into the whole broader subject of disinformation, and it would be very important to say the obvious that ChatGPT is going to increase the disinformation problem. But this discussion features upon a paradox I've been railing about for years. Information on the internet is far less accurate generally than information that we get elsewhere, because we have discriminating tools. We can watch your body language, we can explore your bias, we can check information more readily than if it comes at us with the fury of the speed of the internet. And particularly for our friends who have grown up entirely in the internet age, I've been saying for years, why do you believe what you read? 50% of it is false. So now when we find out that there is an accuracy problem with ChatGPT, sometimes I think it may help us make internet purveyors, the general public, more skeptical, which is good. Because the people who perpetrate purposeful disinformation are the real villains in the disinformation problem, but the environment where people who consume information over the internet just accept it as gospel when it is far less reliable than any other medium.
And I think one of the reasons is because so much of what people read is free. So you can Google anything and results pop up. What about the fact that GPT is free right now? Is that important? Should it remain free? Is this important? Is this an important element in terms of democratization of this access? Maybe is it important to have this as a free resource for disinformation purposes, that you want everybody to have access to the same tool?
Which one should go first?
Go ahead.
Okay, when we're talking about the fact that it's free, I want to raise a point. To me, the thing that comes to mind immediately is copyright issues. It really bothers me when technologies like all of the generative AI, like how do they work? What do they do? It's not magic, right? They take information from the internet, they train an algorithm on it, and now they can spit it out. I saw this amazing video by this musician called David Hickton. He used ChatGPT to say, write me like a song in the style of Eminem, and he did. And then David Hickton went to another generative AI that produces audio and had Eminem rap about it. And then he used it. So he's a musician. He does like some kind of electronic music. So he played it in one of his concerts, and it was as if he was playing with Eminem. He did it as a joke, but it was really successful. And so how did this happen? It happened because this algorithm, when they train, they just take a bunch of Eminem's creations. And now we have a new song, not written by Eminem. Did Eminem agree to be in a concert with David Hickton? No. And so this tool is kind of like free, but on the backs of people who have created content. And so when I think of the cost, I think it's common to underappreciate the fact that there is content that was created by someone who has rights on it that is now taken and provided to others for free in a way that also could potentially take that initial person out of business.
But can I add a counter argument to that?
Yeah.
If you speak up.
Okay, because Eminem didn't really write the exact lyrics.
That's
Like,
right.
it's how is it different than like a person reading Eminem's lyrics and then coming up with something that's really similar?
Yeah.
I don't see like any problem. It's like reading the book and then coming up with ideas that are similar to the ones that you saw in the book. Nobody like questions you like this is not, like, as long as you are generating this idea on your own, I mean, you've read like hundreds of books, but you don't have to reference each and every one of them when you're like talking. So I feel like when we put like higher standards on AI, before we actually have, before solving the problem for human beings, you know, I feel like it's a little bit unfair to the AI systems because like right now, if people comment online, nobody asks them, hey, where did you get that information? But then we expect that from AI systems. We haven't already solved the problem with human beings, but we now want to solve a much more complicated problem with the AI. So I would say that again, it's like genuine content that's being generated, even though it is similar to like previous contents. And I feel like the fact that it's free might actually be better because like if it's like, let's say it's behind a paywall, there are still like, you know, like actors that have like bad intentions and they have like access to like money that they cannot have access to these models. And then just putting these models behind a paywall means that the general public will not have access to these models to basically counter the effect of those malicious actors.
I want to say that as a good point and great point in discussion, but I want to say as a general matter, I've been very strong on the proposition that we need to have a democratic, accessible internet. But never was it more clear to me how much an imperative that was than when I went to work in Washington on the coronavirus crisis. When people absolutely had to have internet access as an essential component of their ability to take care of their health, their family, and their children. And I had my eyes opened about what large swaths of this country have no internet access. And that even in places where there's access, the numbers of people in this country who can't afford access. So to me, the internet is going to have to become more a utility than a business if we're going to have the promises of our founding documents of freedom and justice for all. But when you talk about original thought, there's a component of emerging frontiers of technology that does become original thought. And you heard me earlier talk about my valuing the protection of originality and creation and invention. I think that we need to remember that in all of this, we're talking about, is the robot going to control the human or is the human going to control the robot? And we need to recognize that whoever decided what to call this didn't call it original intelligence, they called it artificial intelligence. They didn't even call it additional intelligence. In my life experience, the people I really respect are people who can think in an original way, that they don't recycle the work of others. That's why, for example, in academics, we penalize plagiarism. We want you to be able to reason. You can draw from original thought, but we need your reasoning to be original. You can't just adopt the reasoning of others. As a lawyer, I've always respected people who could think in an original way. What I really worry about with artificial intelligence is our over-reliance upon it to the point where we lose our appreciation for invention, creativity, and originality, and that the law would somehow not protect that.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so
Introduce yourself and speak up.
Speak loudly.
my name is Srinath. I'm a student at GSB. Learned a lot, so thank you all for taking the time to speak with us. And I just that's a really interesting insight about like originality and like sort of like this notion of like artificial intelligence. I saw a talk by CGM when I believe Annette was in attendance about Aura and the NFTs. And so that question of like original art versus the art that's created online. And so I think one of the things that AI does is it arms our sense of self, or at least it causes this kind of like uncertain feeling in us of like, are we really authentic? Are we really like, who are we really? Like, is there something original going on in my head? Or am I just like, again, it's this free will versus determinism of like, am I just spouting out the stuff that I have just absorbed subconsciously rather than like consciously thinking about everything I've said? And so, and also just thinking about AI thinking, and this is kind of my question here. And real quick, just another anecdote. When I was in elementary school, we started learning how to do cursive, and then like the year later, we started learning how to type, and then so all my cursive skills got lost. And like I don't remember like a time when I had to like actually handwrite something. And I'm thinking with AI is here to stay. Like it's very clear that the way students are thinking, the way students are expected to think in terms of like writing essays or like doing papers, or even like asking them to like argue about something, that's going to change. And like professors and teachers are going to have to really like rethink the way in which assignments are done. So maybe my question to all of you is like, what do you think AI is going to take away, or not necessarily take away, but like maybe we might not need to like do like things like lit reviews and like sort of like this original research, but this idea of like application might really be in front of human beings to decide. So my question, that's sort of my question. What do you think what AI takes away, and what now is truly has to be like up to humans to do?
And I just want to steer that question, because I think that's a very big one and it's a broad one, and that could take a whole nother panel. But I think what you got to at the very end was sort of the next question I had in mind, was to wrap things up with the panel, because we had just incredible amount of questions, huge audience out there on the internet, actually quite a huge audience. But in terms of mitigating risk, I think that's sort of the gist of this question, is how can we mitigate risk, and especially to the classroom environment. So this is a university. I want us to be thinking about these issues. I know we have a lot of professors who are tuned in, very curious about this and how to mitigate risk. You know, what would you suggest is one thing to wrap up? Because I know that risk mitigation isn't something we discussed a whole lot today.
Well, one thing I would want to say that's actually related to your free question, should it be free, and also related to what it's going to take away, is I think that there's been for a long time an idea that technology will replace teachers. So the idea of programmed instruction in the 1960s, I could name a dozen other technologies that will do away with teachers. We no longer need teachers, and we will no longer need to write lit reviews because ChatGPT can write them. We will no longer need to write introductions, whatever, right? And I think that there's a lot of rhetoric around that, but the risk, to get to your question about risk, is that I think that there may be an idea that the product of writing is more important than the process that we go through as students, which is the reflective learning. Like, why do you write a lit review in the first place? Is it for citations, or is it to understand the literature before you, so that when you add to the knowledge, then you actually understand what's coming ahead or what's coming behind you, and where you're building? And that, I would say, is like a real purpose of education question. And so to mitigate risk, I guess I would say we need to make sure that universities are not thinking that this technology is going to replace teaching, that they're not going to say, well, we can have ChatGPT instead of writing centers, or we can have, AI replace teachers of writing. I think that that's really, really important. I mean, there's a lot of other academic dishonesty questions that I think we've all dealt with too, but that's I think a major thing that I would say for that.
In my opinion, we need to elevate and preserve reasoning skills. That's what distinguishes humans. Recitation of something someone else said is distinct from reasoning. If I do a Google search, I'm still reasoning because I'm deciding which parts of it to extend and drop down and move on from. As a professor in the classroom, I've always been very liberal to allow my students to have access to any materials, to take the material home, because what they access is part of the test and how they reason. And when I read their papers, I'm looking for how they've reasoned. Recitation of what others say, whether you're talking about artificial intelligence or the preservation of our democracy, which is at risk, is the most pressing imperative for not only the United States, but humanity.
How do I follow that? Okay, risk mitigation, and then I also want to address some things from your question. Yeah, so in the context of universities especially, I think we need to have rules for using LLMs, especially LLMs that generate text. And I think we need to have 4 rules specifically. One is about authorship. I don't think that LLMs should count as authors when we submit to journals. Second is about transparency. Papers that use LLMs, we should require that they say which LLM they used and how exactly it was used. It's important for reproducibility. That is a value. And of course, conflicts of interest as more and more of these companies become commercial. Then fact checking. Papers must explain exactly what they did to fact check. Did they do it manually? Did they do it with another AI? How did they do it? So it must be said in the paper. And then fourth is anti-plagiarism policies. Papers must, even if the LLM doesn't tell me where this idea is coming from, it's the author's job to trace those citation tracks and tell me where the idea is coming from to prevent plagiarism. So I think for risk mitigation, when I think in the university context, these are things which we should require of our students and also of ourselves when we write papers. Another really important thing for risk mitigation, content that is synthetic or generated should be marked as such. It is key, it is important, and we should, I mean, all the standards and lists of principles, they require that. Also, the EU AI Act also requires that when it comes into effect, that it's obvious to everyone that it will. But content that is synthetic should be marked as such. Content that is, we should develop a standard to mark content that is authentic. There's a nonprofit that does this. I'm not affiliated with them, but their name is the Content Authenticity Initiative. I think this is the right approach. So we should lean into technologies like that. How do you mark content that is synthetic so that we know what to believe, at least? And then to your question, well, just addressing one facet of it. As I said, my background is philosophy. That was my PhD. There are so many ways to teach philosophy. There are so many things to do with it. There are so many things that philosophy is, if it is anything at all. But at universities, some of the activities of teaching philosophy, one kind of activity is, hey, you read Plato, now tell me what Plato said. That's one kind of activity. There's another activity, which is, hey, students, you just came into this class because you've had some kind of a question in mind. What was this question? Let's think about it together. And I personally, I favor the latter, not that the first has no value, but I favor the latter. And I always wished there was more of it. And one of my hopes for this technology is to push pedagogy to go more into that direction, because the point is not to say what Plato said. I think that is my perception of philosophy. The point is to think about that topic, your itch, scratch it, think about it. And I think we can do more to help students grow in that way. And that is, even if ChatGPT could write some paper about this topic, it wouldn't scratch your itch. It's not your itch. It's not your thing. And so I hope that it's another good reason for maybe shifting pedagogy this way a little bit more.
I hope so too. That sounds awesome.
So along those lines, I just want to say that this is a really nice way to wrap up this session. This idea of reason, this idea of debate. That's actually one of the big reasons we set up the Center for Governance and Markets, was to foster these kinds of debates, sometimes over difficult issues, but really to model what disagreement looks like. And it's really great to have these diverse perspectives from such diverse backgrounds talking about this really important issue that we're just beginning to navigate. So I want to thank you all very much for taking the time to be with us today. We had hundreds of people online, so it was a big audience. Thanks to all of you out there in the ether, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.